So the next concept is the concept of stare decisis. Now, this really looks at different types of question that can come upon this area. A lot of it you've already covered, you already know, but specifically you could be asked a question about the concept of stare decisis. So if that's the case, then these are the areas that you need to pull together in order to answer the question. So again, it's the same idea and the same structure. So remember, it's your DFC structure. So first of all, you need a clear definition. Now bear in mind, these questions are out of 15. You're not going to get 15 marks for a simple definition, right? So therefore, that's why we need to pull some of the things that we've already learnt together to answer a full 15-mark question. So we should already know what the concept of stare decisis means. So stare decisis means let the previous decision stand, and it underpins the whole of judicial precedent. And again, when we've looked at binding previously, there's obviously a massive overlap, and it's the same thing ultimately, that if we follow binding precedent, ultimately we're following the concept of stare decisis by letting the previous decision stand. And really, judicial precedent completely is underpinned by stare decisis. Now, the way that the question works, if it said something like describe the concept of stare decisis or describe the term stare decisis, once you've done your definition, you then need to explain how stare decisis works. And how we do that is look at these 4 things to explain that stare decisis can only work by these 4. Right? So what you have to do is not only explain what these 4 are, but explain clearly how those 4 work with stare decisis. So for example, if we take the first thing is the hierarchy of courts. Right? Now, if you just explained what the hierarchy of courts is, you'd get some marks, but you wouldn't get full marks. You need to explain how the hierarchy of courts helps, aids, works with the concept of stare decisis. So we obviously know what the hierarchy of courts are. So the courts in England and Wales are in a rank order. But then we need to specifically explain how that links to the concept of stare decisis. So first of all, you need to talk about, obviously, binding. So you would say something like binding precedents uphold the concept of stare decisis because they have to be followed, right? And again, what I would do there is I would use examples, right? So the best example is using Supreme Court. So you say that the Supreme Court is the top domestic court in this country. They create binding precedents which all other courts within the hierarchy must follow, and by those lower courts following in them, then ultimately it upholds the concept of stare decisis. Right? Again, you then can go on to persuasive. Now really, obviously we know what persuasive means, so they don't have to be followed, but they can be. But again, they still can link to hierarchy, and they can still link to the concept of stare decisis. So persuasive upholds stare decisis if it is followed. So for example, if a court of appeal create a persuasive precedent that is later followed by the Supreme Court, then again you're following the concept of stare decisis, because remember, you're turning a persuasive into a binding. And obviously binding ultimately links to stare decisis. Again, we've got another case example down there, which again we've already used. So if you remember, in the case of Brown in the obiter, that was followed by the case of Wilson. So in Brown's obiter, they said that branding they thought was acceptable and that you could consent to branding, and this was later followed in the case of Wilson. So remember, Wilson turns Brown's obiter into a ratio, into a binding precedent, therefore following the concept of stare decisis. Right? Now, the second factor, again, we ultimately cannot do without, is law reports. Now, law reports is basically a report of the law. Why is this so fundamentally important? Well, if we don't know what the law is, how do we know what we need to follow? So I would probably say that law reports is one of the key things, because unless we have them, then each court, whether it be a Crown, whether it be a Court of Appeal, whatever court it may be, will have no idea what they have to follow. Right? So ultimately, stare decisis relies on those reports, because those reports are explaining to each judge what they have to follow, therefore upholding the concept of stare decisis. The third thing is the ratio. We know what ratio decidendi means, so we know that reason. And remember, that's the bit they have to follow. Yeah, so that is the binding element that they must follow. Again, always link it to stare decisis. So you say obviously the ratio is fundamental to stare decisis, because that's the part they follow. So if, for example, if you use like Brown or any sort of case, whatever that ratio is, it's followed by every other court where it's same or similar facts. The case example that we've got down there is the case of Daniels. This was a negligence case, and Daniels followed the ratio in Donahue and Stevenson. Right? So we know Donahue and Stevenson, stale and ginger beer, and it was Daniels who followed that ratio. Again, by following a ratio of another case, you are upholding stare decisis. Now, the last element really kind of doesn't overlink to how we follow stare decisis, it's how we can avoid it, right? So those three, so hierarchy, law reports and ratio, have to be in place for stare decisis to work. But then you also need a little paragraph about how sometimes stare decisis can be overlooked. And when stare decisis is overlooked, it's avoiding a binding precedent. Be careful not to waffle on too much about this. Remember, we've already looked at avoiding, and you can get a separate question on that. If it is a stare decisis question, you just need 4 paragraphs. So avoiding would just need to be a paragraph long, right? So where judges avoid a binding precedent, that means they don't follow the ratio, therefore stare decisis is overlooked. Yeah, and we know our 4 types, so distinguishing, reversing, overruling, and per incuriam. If it was a question on stare decisis, I'd literally do a sentence on each one. So tell me how avoiding links to stare decisis, then tell me each type with a simple definition, so literally a line, and then use the case examples that link to stare decisis. Right? So a couple of examples then. So it mentions down there about the House of Lords, or obviously now the Supreme Court. Remember, they can overrule their own decisions. Where the Supreme Court does overrule their own decisions, it means that stare decisis is overlooked. We ignore stare decisis, scrap an old law and create a new one. Again, case example down there, R versus R. R versus R, remember, it was a Supreme Court, well, House of Lords at the time, and they made a new decision. So they overruled an old law, saying that now a husband can be guilty of raping his wife. Again, by overruling, it means that we're not following the concept of stare decisis, and the concept of stare decisis is overlooked. Right? Now, sometimes that can happen, so sometimes we can avoid, but we still like this idea of concept of stare decisis. Judicial precedent is stare decisis ultimately. And how important that is shown in some cases. So sometimes judges will realise that maybe that decision's a bit out of date or it's a bit rubbish, but they'll still follow it. And you think, well, why would you do that? And the reason why you would do that is because of this concept of stare decisis. We always need a balance, and we'll look at this when we look at overruling in the Supreme Court. We need a balance. We don't want to be chopping and changing our laws all the time, but then at the same time, we appreciate that the law has to be flexible, and it has to change because of social changes. So it just depends on the scenario. But stare decisis is an important concept, and judges sometimes will admit the decision previously is bad, but they'll turn around and say, do you know what, I'm not going to avoid, I am still going to follow it. So they can admit that it's wrong, but still follow it. It just shows how strong stare decisis is. And that happened in the case of Jones. So out of the 7 judges, 4 said that the old decision, which was a case of redowling, that old decision was rubbish. But even though they turned around and admitted that it was rubbish, they still followed it. So it just really shows the importance of stare decisis to the judges.